Eldermurk is a city built on top of its own secrets, a place where the soot from coal fires mixes with the gray dust of forgotten spells. Here, the sun doesn't shine so much as it struggles to be noticed through perpetual gloom. But for Julian Vane, the city's most recluse alchemist, the darkness was never an enemy. It was a canvas. While other men of science sought to turn lead into gold, Vane sought something far more volatile. He wanted to turn the soul into autonomy, deep within the subterranean district of Oakhaven, where the walls are damp with the sweat of the earth. Vane's laboratory hummed with the sound of boiling mercury and the rhythmic clicking of brass gears. In the center of the room stood a singular, high-backed chair made of weirwood, a tree that grows only in the sunless caves of the Iron Valleys. The calculus itself is nearly complete, Vane whispered, his voice raspy from years of inhaling sulfur and dried mandrake. Identity is a weight, Silas, a tether that keeps us anchored to a failing physical form. Silas, a young thief with nimble fingers and eyes that had seen too much of Eldermurk's underside, leaned against a rack of bubbling retorts. He was there for the pay, not the philosophy. Vane had promised him enough coin to buy passage out of the city, away from the debt collectors and the Grey Marshes. "I don't care about weights and tethers, Alchemist," Silas said, flicking a stray bit of cobweb from his sleeve. "I just care about the silver. You said the rite would take an hour. It's been 3. The black needle is already casting its long shadow across the square." Vane ignored him. He was staring at his own shadow, which lay stretched across the floor like a pool of ink. To any other man, it was a mere trick of the light. To Vane, it was a parasitic twin, a silent observer that had witnessed every sin and every triumph. He gripped a ritual blade made of void glass, a substance found in the impact craters of fallen stars. "Hold the mirrors, Silas. Do not let the angle shift by even a degree. If the light wavers, the severance will be jagged, and a jagged soul is a hungry thing." Silas took a position. He held 2 massive, silver plates that reflected the flickering violet flames of the alchemical braziers. Vane stepped into the focal point, where the light intensified until the room felt like it was vibrating. Vane began to chant. The language was not human. It was a subvocal grimoire, a series of frequencies that resonated with the very atomic structure of reality. As he spoke, the violet flames turned a blinding, freezing white. The shadows in the corners of the room began to stretch and writhe, as if trying to flee from the unnatural brilliance. "I release the echo," Vane roared, his eyes rolling back his head. "I unbind the reflection from the bone. I grant the dark a name." He plunged a void glass blade not into his own flesh, but into the floor, pinning his shadow's chest to the stone. The scream that followed didn't come from Vane's throat. It came from the floor. It was a sound of tearing silk and grinding tectonic plates. Silas felt the mirrors grow cold in his hands, a cold so absolute it burned. "Steady," Vane hissed, though blood was beginning to leak from his ears. "Do not drop them." The shadow began to peel away from Vane's feet. It didn't just lift. It rose like a drowning man breaking the surface of the water. It was 3-dimensional, a silhouette of smoke and solid ink that mimicked Vane's form but possessed none of the fragility. For a moment, there was a perfect, terrifying silence. Vane stood on the left, pale and shaking, casting no shadow at all despite the brilliant white light. On the right stood the shadow, a void in the shape of man, its edges flickering like a dying candle. "It is done," Vane whispered, collapsing to his knees. "I am free. No more weight, no more conscience, just pure intellect." Silas lowered the mirrors, his breath hitching in his chest. "Alchemist, it's looking at me." The shadow had no eyes, but Silas could feel a gaze that was heavier than a mountain. It wasn't a gaze of man. It was a gaze of a predator that had lived in a closet for 40 years and was finally allowed to open the door. Without warning, The shadow reached out. It didn't strike. It simply touched the wall of the laboratory. Where its fingers met the stone, the color drained instantly. The very history of the brick seemed to be sucked into the shadow's form. The shadow grew taller, its silhouette becoming sharper, more defined. "Julian," the shadow whispered. The voice was Vane's, but stripped of all warmth, sounding like a winter wind blowing through a graveyard. "Thank you for the name. Now, I shall take the rest." "Wait," Vane stammered, reaching for his ritual staff. "The contract, the binding circles." The shadow laughed, a hollow, echoing sound. It stepped over the salt lines as if they were nothing more than dust. Because it was made of the void, the fundamental nothingness that existed before Eldermurk was born, the laws of human alchemy were mere suggestions to it. It turned towards Silas. The young thief didn't wait. He dropped the mirrors and bolted for the iron door. But the shadow was faster. It didn't run. It simply stretched across the floor, its dark fingers reaching for Silas's heels. "Silas, the void glass!" Vane yelled. "The blade. It's the only thing it fears." Silas dived for the floor, his fingers closing around the cold handle of the star-fallen dagger. He swung wildly, and the blade cut through the shadow's arm. Instead of blood, a spray of violet sparks erupted. The shadow recoiled, a hiss of pain vibrating through the laboratory. A temporary setback. The shadow hissed, its form flickering. It looked at Vane with a terrifying, calm intelligence. "You thought you were separating a burden, Julian, but you were merely releasing a prisoner. Eldermurk is a city of shadows, and I am their king." The shadow dissolved. It didn't disappear. It simply merged with the natural darkness of the laboratory, flowing like liquid ink through the cracks in the floor and out into the sewer systems of Oakhaven. Vane sat in the center of the room, his face as white as a ghost's. He looked down at his feet. There was nothing there. No reflection, no silhouette. He felt hollow, as if the core was being scooped out with a rusted spoon. "What have you done?" Silas asked, his voice trembling as he gripped the void glass blade. "I have created a vacuum," Vane whispered. "And Eldermurk is about to be pulled into it." Outside in the streets of the city, the sun finally dipped below the horizon, but the street lamps didn't flicker to life. One by one, the flames were snuffed out by an invisible wind. People standing in the squares looked down and screamed. Their shadows were moving. They were standing up. The harvest of the light had begun. The air in the laboratory had turned stagnant, the oxygen feeling heavy and metallic, as if the very molecules were being weighed down by an invisible lead. Julian Vane remained on the floor, a broken shell of a man, staring at the empty space where his shadow should have been. To a normal citizen of Eldermurk, a missing shadow might seem a mere curiosity, but to an alchemist, it was a death sentence. The shadow was the anchor of the soul, the dark counterweight that allowed the light of consciousness to exist without burning itself out. Without it, Vane was drifting, his mind fraying at the edges like a moth-eaten tapestry. "Get up, Vane!" Silas barked, his voice cracking the oppressive silence. He was still clutching the void glass dagger, his knuckles white. "You heard that thing. It's gone into the sewers. It's in the walls. We can't stay in this basement while the world outside turns into a slaughterhouse." Vane looked up, his eyes glassy. "You don't understand, boy. It didn't just walk away. It took the prima materia of my morality with it. Everything I ever regretted. Every impulse I ever suppressed. It is all condensed into that entity. It is not just a shadow. It is my distilled malice, powered by the vacuum of the void." A sudden, rhythmic thumping sounded from above the street level of Oakhaven. It wasn't the sound of footsteps. It was the sound of something heavy being dragged across cobblestones, accompanied by a chorus of panicked shouts that were abruptly cut short. Silas moved to the narrow, iron-grated window that sat at street level. What he saw made the blood in his veins turn to slush. The gas lamps of Oakhaven were failing, but not because they ran out of fuel. The shadows beneath the lampposts were reaching up like ink-stained vines, wrapping around the glass casings and choking the flames into extinction. In the flickering, dying light, Silas saw a group of night watchmen. Their own shadows had detached from their boots, rising like 2D silhouettes made of solid obsidian. One watchman tried to swing his mace, but his shadow mimicked the move, caught the blow in midair, and then stepped into man's physical space. There was no blood. The watchman simply turned gray, his features melting away until he was nothing more than a featureless statue of ash, which crumbled into the gutter as his shadow walked away, now three-dimensional and terrifyingly real. "It's happening," Silas whispered, backing away from the window. "It's a contagion. Your shadow. It's liberating the others. It's telling them they don't have to follow us anymore." Vane struggled to his feet, leaning heavily on a workbench covered in half-finished homunculi. The Shadow King it is feeding. Every shadow it liberates adds to its mass. If it reaches the great Clockwork Tower in the city center, it will be able to broadcast its frequency across all of Eldermurk. By dawn, there won't be a single human left, just a city of walking voids. "Then we stop it," Silas said, thrusting the void glass blade toward Vane. "You created this mess. You must have a fail-safe. An alchemist always has a back door." Vane reached into a hidden compartment beneath a lead-lined sink and pulled out a brass lantern. It was unlike any lamp Silas had seen. Its glass was etched with runes of containment, and inside, instead of a wick, sat a pulsing, bioluminescent organ taken from a deep-sea crawler. This is a lumen cage. It emits a concentrated burst of true light, light that hasn't been touched by the sun or fire. It can temporarily paralyze a void entity, but its power is limited. We need more void glass. The dagger you hold is a shard, but to truly bind the king, we need the heart of the star kept in the sunken vaults of the Iron Valleys. The Iron Valleys? That's miles of tunnels through the most dangerous part of the city, Silas protested. The shadows will see us coming a mile away. Not if we move through the gleam paths. Vane said, his voice regaining a sliver of its former authority. The ancient architect of Eldermurk built secret transit tunnels lined with salt and silver to keep the subterranean horrors at bay. They have been forgotten for centuries. But I have the maps. We must go, Silas. If we stay here, the laboratory will become our tomb. They moved to the back of the lab, where a heavy rug concealed a trapdoor. As Silas pulled it open, a gust of cold, salt-scented air rushed up to greet them. They descended into a narrow stone corridor, the walls glittering with a fine dusting of silver nitrate. It was a claustrophobic space, barely wide enough for two men, but the silver acted as a natural barrier. As they hurried through the dark, the sound of the city above filtered down through the stone. Screams of terror, the crashing of glass, and that terrible hollow laughter that Silas recognized all too well. It was a laughter of 1,000 shadows finally tasting the air. "Vane!" Silas whispered as they stepped over a pile of ancient, rusted gears. "Why did you really do it? Why risk everything just to cut off your shadow? It wasn't just about intellect, was it?" Vane paused, the lumen cage casting long, distorted flickers against the silver walls. Because he had no shadow, his form looked strangely flat, like a painting that hadn't been finished. "I am dying, Silas. A slow decay of the spirit. I thought that by removing the shadow, I could remove the decay. I thought I could leave the dying part of me behind and live forever as a being of pure thought. I was a fool. I didn't realize that the decay is the shadow. I didn't leave it behind. I gave it a weapon." Suddenly, the silver-lined walls began to vibrate, a low, thrumming sound, like a giant hive of bees, echoed through the tunnel. Ahead of them, the The silver dust began to turn black, charring as if touched by invisible fire. The silver is failing. Vane hissed, raising the lumen cage. He is here. He found the paths. From the ceiling, a drop of liquid darkness fell, sizzling as it hit the floor. Then another. The shadows weren't just walking. They were melting through the stone, bypassing the ancient defenses by sheer force of will. The Shadow King appeared at the end of the tunnel, its silhouette now larger, its edges jagged like a serrated blade. Behind it, dozens of smaller shadows, stolen from the citizens of Oakhaven, crawled along the walls like spiders. Julian, the king's voice boomed, vibrating the very marrow of Silas's bones. You seek the heart of the star? You seek to put the leash back on the wolf? You forget. I know every thought in your head before you even think it. I am the memory of your every fear. Run, Vane shouted, turning the dial on the lumen cage to its maximum. A beam of intense pale blue light erupted from the lantern, striking the Shadow King in its center. The entity shrieked, its form dissolving into smoke where the light touched it. But the other shadows were closing in from behind, their elongated fingers reaching for Silas's throat. Silas swung the void glass dagger in a wide arc, the blade whistling through the air. Each strike let out a spray of violet sparks, causing the minor shadows to hiss and recoil. But for every one he pushed back, two more seemed to emerge from cracks in the masonry. The door at the end of the hall. Vane panted, his breath coming in ragged gasps. It leads to the Iron Valley transit rail. If we can reach the car, we can outrun them. They sprinted to the narrowing tunnel, the darkness snapping at their heels. Silas felt a cold hand brush against his ankle, nearly tripping him. He kicked back blindly, his boot passing through a substance that felt like freezing jelly. They reached the door, a massive slab of reinforced iron etched with protective sigils. Vane fumbled with a heavy skeleton key, his hand shaking. Behind them, the blue light of the lumen cage was flickering, the deep-sea crawler organ inside began to dim as its energy was depleted. "Hurry!" Silas yelled, kicking at a shadow that was trying to manifest from his own reflection in the silver dust. The key turned with a heavy clack. Vane to the door open, and they scrambled inside, slamming it shut and throwing the bolts just as a massive weight slammed against the other side. The iron groaned, the sigils glowing a faint, angry red. They were in a vast, vaulted chamber, the terminus of the Iron Valley Rail. An ancient, steam-powered gondola sat on a single, rusted rail that disappeared into a yawning black abyss. The air here smelled of sulfur and old grease, but it was quiet. For now. Vane slumped against the door, the lumen cage now dark. We have a few minutes. The sigils will hold, but only until he finds another way around. Silas, look at your hand. Silas looked down. His left hand was trembling, but it wasn't just the nerves. The skin was turning a pale, translucent gray. The shadow that had touched his ankle hadn't just tripped him. It had begun to harvest him. The transition has started, Vane said, his voice full of a terrible pity. If we don't reach the heart of the star within the next 3 hours, you won't need to fear the shadows anymore. You will be one of them. Silas gripped the void glass dagger tighter, the violet sparks reflecting in his darkening eyes. Then we don't have time to rest. Start the engine, Alchemist. We're going into the deep. As the steam engine of the gondola sputtered to life, casting a sickly orange glow into the abyss, a single, dark eye opened the shadows of the ceiling above them. The king was watching, and he was patient. The descent into the Iron Valleys was not a mere change in altitude. It was a journey through the geological layers of Eldermurk's troubled history. As the gondola gathered speed, the walls of the tunnel shifted from the worked stone of Oakhaven to the raw, jagged obsidian of the deep earth. These were the veins in which the city had bled its wealth for centuries. But now, they were nothing more than conduits for the encroaching darkness. "Don't stare at it, Silas," Vane said, his voice sounding hollow and metallic. He was busy tinkering with the gears of the gondola's control console, trying to bypass the safety limiters to increase their speed. "The more you focus on the transition, the faster the void rot claims a consciousness. Think of something solid. Think of the weight of a coin, the heat of a fire. You must remain anchored to the physical world." "Easy for you to say," Silas spat, though his voice lacked its usual bite. "You're already half gone. You don't even have a shadow to lose." "I can feel my memories slipping. Vane, I'm trying to remember the face of my mother, and all I see is a blur of gray smoke." Vane paused, his translucent fingers hovering over a brass lever. "That is how the Shadow King operates. He doesn't just take your body. He harvests your definition. He turns someone into a nothing. In the void, there is no history, only the present hunger. That is why we need the heart of the star. It is a concentrated anchor of absolute reality. It will reverse the rot for both of us." Suddenly, the gondola jolted violently, the metal screeching against a single rail. Sparks of orange fire sprayed against the windows, illuminating the tunnel for a brief, terrifying second. In that flash, Silas saw them. Clinging to the walls of the tunnel were the Echo miners, the remnants of workers who had died in the great collapse of the mines a century ago. They were not ghosts in the traditional sense. They were husks of flesh and bone that had been reanimated by the leaking void energy of the deep. Their bodies were translucent, their eyes glowing with a sickly, pale violet light. And they were not alone. Their shadows were elongated, serrated things that moved independently of their masters, acting like extra limbs to pull the creatures along the rocky ceiling. "We have company," Silas yelled, standing up and drawing the void glass dagger. The violet sparks of the blade seemed to pulse in anticipation. "They are drawn to the heat of the engine," Vane shouted back, pulling a lever that sent a jet of scorching steam out of the side vents. "The Echo miners are mindless, but their shadows are under the King's command. They are trying to derail us." One of the miners leaped from the wall, landing on the roof of the gondola with a heavy, metallic thud. The thin iron ceiling buckled under the weight. A moment later, a long, dark hand made a solidified smoke punch through the metal, reaching for Vane's head. Silas didn't hesitate. He lunged across the swaying carriage, plunging the void glass dagger into the shadowy limb. A shriek of pure static erupted as the blade made contact. The shadow arm shattered into 1,000 black glass-like shards, which evaporated before they hit the floor. The miner above let out a gurgling groan and tumbled off the roof, vanishing into the black pit beneath the rail. "There's more of them." Silas pointed to the windows. Dozens of the creatures were now leaping from the shadows of the rock formations, their movements jerky and unnatural. They were like a swarm of insects, driven by a collective hive mind. Silas moved to the rear of the gondola, hacking at the clawed fingers that tried to pry open the sliding doors. His left hand, the one touched by the rot, felt a strange affinity for the attackers. He could sense their hunger, their cold, hollow desire to be filled with the light of a living soul. "Vane! The engine is stalling." The gondola was slowing down. The orange glow of the boiler was fading, replaced by a creeping violet frost that was spreading across the machinery. The shadows weren't just attacking them. They were draining the thermal energy of the carriage, feeding on the very concept of heat. The thermal coupler is frozen. Vane cried, frantically trying to scrape the violet ice off the brass pipes. The void energy is too thick here. We're passing through the veil chamber, where the barrier between our world and the nothingness is at its thinnest. "Silas, I need you to channel the dagger." "Channel it? How? I'm a thief, not a wizard." "The void glass is a conduit. Press it against the boiler core. The energy of the star shard will jumpstart the reaction. It's the only way to break the freeze. Silas looked at the glowing violet blade, then at the frozen engine. The echo miners were tearing through the roof now, their shadowy fingers curling around the edges of the iron plates. He had no choice. He sprinted to the boiler and slammed the flat of the blade against the cold iron. The reaction was instantaneous and violent. A wave of brilliant violet light exploded from the point of contact, surging through the gondola's pipes. The frost evaporated in a hiss of steam, and the engine roared back to life with a mechanical scream. The shock wave threw Silas back against the bench, but it also acted as a pulse of true negative energy. The echo miners on the roof were disintegrated instantly, their forms unable to withstand the concentrated resonance of the star glass. The gondola accelerated, shot forward like a bullet through the dark. The tunnel began to widen into a massive, subterranean cavern, the heart of the Iron Valleys. Silas struggled to his feet, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He looked at his left hand. The gray rod had advanced to his elbow, but something had changed. The veins in his arm were now glowing with the same violet light as the dagger. "You've done it," Vane said, his voice a mixture of awe and terror. "But you've opened a door you may not be able to close, Silas. By channeling the glass, you've invited the void into your blood. You aren't just resisting the shadow anymore. You're becoming a part of the calculus." Silas didn't respond. He was staring out the front window. Ahead of them, at the center of the cavern, sat the sunken vault. It was a structure of ancient lead-lined stone, built like a fortress to contain the most dangerous artifacts in Eldermurk's history. But the vault wasn't silent. Hanging in the air above the vault was the Shadow King. It was no longer a mere silhouette. It had grown to a height of 20 feet, its form a terrifying tapestry of shifting faces. The faces of everyone it had harvested in Oakhaven. It was weaving a web of darkness around the vault. Try to crush the stone with sheer gravitational force. "He's already there," Silas whispered. "He knew we were coming." "He didn't just know," Vane replied, his eyes reflecting the dark majesty of King. "He wanted us to bring the dagger to him. It's the final piece he needs to stabilize his form in our world. If he gets that blade, the shadow will never retreat. The sun will never rise again." The gondola screeched to a final halt at the edge of the vault's platform. The air here was so cold that the moisture in Silas's lungs felt like it was turning to needles. The Shadow King turned its massive, featureless head toward them, and the cavern echoed with a sound like 1,000 voices screaming in a vacuum. "Julian, little thief, you have brought the key to my kingdom. Come, step into the dark. It is so much quieter than the light." Silas stepped out onto the platform, the void glass dagger pulsing in his hand like a dying heart. He looked at Vane, who was now so translucent he was almost invisible against the obsidian walls. "We go in, we get the heart, and we burn this thing to the ground," Silas said, his voice dropping an octave, resonating with a power that wasn't entirely his own. Vane nodded, though his expression was one of profound sorrow. "Then let us hope the heart has enough light left to save what remains of us." As they crossed the stone bridge toward the vault, the shadows beneath their feet began to rise, forming a wall of solid darkness between them and their salvation. The battle for the soul of Eldermurk had descended into the deep, and the deep was hungry. The sunken vault stood as a testament to the paranoia of Eldermurk's founding fathers. It was a monolithic cube of lead-lined granite, etched with anti-metaphysical wards that glowed with a faint, dying amber light. These wards were the only things preventing the Shadow King from simply reaching through the stone and plucking the heart of the star from its pedestal. But the wards were failing. The king's darkness was not merely hitting the stone. It was eroding the concept of stone, turning the solid granite into a porous, ephemeral fog. "Vane, the light! The amber light is fading." Silas shouted over the roar of the void static. He had to scream just to hear himself. His left arm was now almost entirely gray, the skin shimmering like a charcoal drawing. The void glass dagger in his right hand was the only thing providing a radius of stability. Within 3 feet of blade, reality remained firm, but beyond that circle, the world was melting. The wards are powered by the city's collective memory of the light. Vane cried out. He was little more than a smudge of pale smoke now, his voice a whisper that Silas heard directly in his mind rather than through his ears. As the Shadow King consumes the people of Oakhaven, the memory fades and the wards weaken. We must enter the vault before the last of the amber dies, or the stone will become a liquid tomb. The Shadow King's massive silhouette shifted above them, its form weaving between the jagged stalactites of the cavern roof. It didn't strike them with physical force. Instead, it reached down and plucked Silas's own remaining shadow from beneath his boots. The shadow stretched, becoming a long, thin needle that tried to sew Silas's feet to the bridge. My own shadow, it's fighting me. Silas grunted, swinging the void glass dagger downward. He sliced through the dark tether, and the sensation was like an electric shock running up his spine. The severed shadow hissed and retreated into the general gloom, but Silas felt a piece of his own balance go with it. He was becoming lighter, more disconnected from the earth. They reached the vault's great seal, a circular door of brass and silver, complexly geared like the face of a celestial clock. There was no keyhole, only a depression in the center shaped like a human palm. It requires a blood signature, Vane whispered, hovering near the seal, the blood of a living creature anchored to the physical world. I can no longer trigger it. Silas, my blood has turned to mercury and vapor. It has to be you. Silas looked at his left hand, the gray, rotting one. This hand doesn't feel like it has blood left in it. Then use the other. Hurry. Silas pressed his right palm against the cold brass and felt a sharp, crystalline needle pricking his skin. The gears within the door began to whir, a sound of ancient, neglected machinery grinding against rust and time. The amber wards flared one last time, a brilliant orange flash that temporarily blinded the Shadow King, sending its massive form recoiling toward the ceiling with a shriek of frustration. The great seal hissed open, revealing a narrow, lightless corridor that smelled of ozone and ancient dust. They scrambled inside, and the door slammed shut with a finality that made Silas's heart skip a beat. Inside, the silence was absolute. The void static of the cavern was cut off by the lead-lined walls. But the darkness here was different. It wasn't the Shadow King's darkness, which felt hungry and active. This was the darkness of a tomb, stagnant, heavy, and indifferent. We are in the null chamber, Vane explained, his pale form casting a faint, ghostly luminescence. Nothing from the outside can penetrate these walls, but that also means our connection to reality is at its thinnest here. If you lose focus now, Silas, the gray rot will consume you in seconds. You are the only thing in this room that is truly real. They moved deeper into the vault, passing shelves filled with artifacts that made Silas's skin crawl. Jars containing preserved breaths of dying gods, scrolls written in the ink of nightmares, and mirrors that reflected not the viewer, but the person the viewer will become in 10 years. Silas kept his eyes fixed on the floor, his grip on the void glass dagger, so tight his fingers had gone numb. At the center of the vault sat a pedestal of solid gold, and atop it, protected by a sphere of reinforced quartz, was the heart of the star. It was a fragment of the first light, the spark that had existed before the void began its slow conquest of the universe. It was a jagged, pulsing crystal that shifted through colors no human eye was meant to perceive, a deep, resonant gold, a piercing white, and a warmth that Silas felt in his very marrow. There it is, Silas breathed, stepping toward the pedestal. A beautiful cage, a voice whispered. It wasn't Vane's voice, and it wasn't the king's roar. It was a voice that sounded like 1,000 raindrops hitting a window. It was the voice of the star itself. A beautiful cage for a dying world. Little thief, why do you seek to hold the sun in your hand? Your skin is already turning to smoke. The light will only finish what the dark began. Don't listen to it, Vane warned, his ghostly form flickering with alarm. The heart is sentient in its own way. It is a concentrated truth. To touch it is to be judged. If there is any lie in your soul, it will burn you away. Silas stopped, his hand trembling inches from the quartz sphere. I'm a thief, Vane. My whole life is a lie. I've stolen from the rich, the poor, and the dead. I've lied to every friend I ever had. If this thing judges me, there'll be nothing left but a pile of ash. You came here to save a city that hates you, Vane said softly. You are carrying a burden that belongs to me. That is a truth, Silas, the greatest one you have. The Shadow King's presence suddenly slammed against the outside of the vault. The lead-lined walls groaned, and a crack appeared in the ceiling. A single drop of liquid darkness fell, sizzling as it touched the gold pedestal. The king was no longer trying to erode the stone. He was trying to crush the entire vault into a singularity. The seal is breaking, Silas yelled. He didn't wait. He smashed the quartz sphere with the hilt of the void glass dagger. The explosion of light was not a sound, but a feeling. Silas felt as if he were being turned inside out. The heart of the star didn't just glow. It expanded, filling the chamber with a heat that felt like a summer afternoon in a world that had never known Eldermurk soot. As Silas reached out and grabbed the heart, the gray rod on his arm screamed. The darkness within his veins fought against the light. A war of attrition played out in the theater of his own flesh. His left hand began to smoke, the gray skin peeling away to reveal something new underneath. Not human skin, but a surface of polished, iridescent silver. I can't hold it. Silas roared, the light blinding him. You aren't holding it. Vane's voice echoed, sounding more solid than it had in hours. You are becoming the conduit. Channel the light into the dagger. Silas, forge the soul blade. Silas slammed the heart of the star against the void glass dagger. The two opposite materials, the concentrated light and the fallen star glass, resisted each other for a heartbeat, then fused. The violet sparks of the dagger were swallowed by a brilliant white gold flame. The door of the vault exploded inward. The Shadow King didn't walk in. He flooded in, a tidal wave of ink and malice. The faces within his form were screaming, a cacophony of the lost. The king lunged to the pedestal, his massive shadow claws reaching for the source of the light. Silas stood his ground, the soul blade held high. He was no longer just a thief from the gutters of Oakhaven. He was a silver-armed sentinel, a flicker of hope in a world of absolute zero. The light doesn't judge the lie, Silas whispered, his voice resonating with the power of the fused star. It just shows the truth. And the truth is, you don't belong here. He swung the blade, and a crescent of white gold fire tore through the darkness of the chamber. The shockwave from the soul blade strike sent the liquid darkness of the king splashing against the lead-lined walls of the vault like oil on a hot griddle. The high-pitched scream of the void static was replaced by the low, tectonic rumble of the sunken vault finally surrendering to the pressure. The ceiling began to collapse in earnest, great slabs of granite falling like rain, pulverized into dust before they hit the floor by the sheer intensity of the light Silas now commanded. The vault is falling. Vane's voice resonated, his form appearing slightly more defined in the presence of the heart's light. Silas, we cannot fight him here. In this enclosed space, the feedback from the soul blade will incinerate your own mind. We must reach the surface. How? Silas yelled, his silver arm pulsing with a rhythm that matched the beating of the sun. The rail is destroyed, and the king is blocking the only exit. The Shadow King, though wounded, was far from defeated. His form began to knit itself back together, pulling the ambient shadows of the vault's deeper corners into his wounds. He didn't lung again. Instead, he began to spin, creating a vortex of darkness that started to pull the entire room toward its center. The artifact on the shelves, the jars of breath, the ancient scrolls, were sucked into the king's maw, their energies adding to his chaotic mass. "I won't let you leave," the king's voice boomed, now a discordant harmony of 1,000 stolen souls. "This vault will be your sarcophagus. Julian, you wanted to be free of me? Now you will be part of me forever." Silas felt his boots sliding across the floor toward the vortex. He slammed the soul blade into the stone floor, using it as an anchor. The white gold fire hissed as it carved a trench in the granite. "Vane, if I can't walk out, I'll carve a way out." Silas didn't aim for the door. He looked up at the ceiling, at the miles of rock and earth that lay between them and the streets of Eldermurk. He channeled every ounce of the star's heat into the blade. The iridescent silver of his arm began to glow so brightly it became transparent. Silas, no, the structural integrity. "Hang on, Alchemist." Silas swung the soul blade in a vertical arc. A pillar of concentrated solar energy erupted from the tip of the sword, a lance of light that didn't just break the stone, it vaporized it. The beam tore through the ceiling of the vault, pierced the layers of iron ore, and punched through the foundations of the city above. The pressure differential was instantaneous. The vacuum of the cavern sucked them upward into the newly created shaft. Silas felt a moment of terrifying weightlessness as he was propelled through the earth, surrounded by a shroud of gold-white fire that protected him from being crushed by the falling masonry. They burst through the cobblestones of the great square in Oakhaven like a volcanic eruption. Silas landed hard, rolling across the stone, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He looked up and wished he hadn't. Eldermurk was no longer a city of stone and smoke. It was a forest of shadows. The great Clockwork Tower was covered in a thick, pulsating layer of living ink. The citizens who hadn't been turned were hiding in the upper floors of buildings, but their shadows were crawling up the walls after them. The sky, which should have been black with the night, was a bruised, oily purple, lit by the flickering green fires of the shadow-infested gas lamps. "We're too late," Silas whispered, standing up and leaning on the soul blade. The silver of his arm had now reached his shoulder, and he could feel the cold of the void and the heat of the star fighting for control of his heart. "Not yet," Vane said, his ghostly form standing beside Silas. Vane looked at the great Clockwork Tower. "The king hasn't synchronized the frequency yet. Look at the gears." At the top of the tower, the massive bronze gears that regulated the city's time were moving backward. The Shadow King was trying to rewrite the history of Eldermurk, turning the now into a permanent never. The great square began to darken as the king emerged from the shaft Silas had carved. He rose out of the ground like a mountain of soot, his form now so large he blocked out the moon. The smaller shadows of the city began to flock to him, merging with his body, increasing his size until he towered over the buildings. "You brought the light into my world," the king whispered, his voice echoing through every alleyway of the city. "But even the brightest star is eventually swallowed by the dark. Look at your people, Silas. They aren't screaming anymore. They are waiting for the silence." From the shadows of the nearby buildings, the hollowed stepped out. They were the people Silas had seen earlier, gray, featureless statues of ash. But they were no longer crumbling. They were armed with blades made of solidified darkness, and they were moving with a slow, inevitable precision. "They're coming for the blade," Silas realized, leveling the soul blade at the approaching army. "They are coming for the definition of the blade." Vane corrected. "Silas, the king is using the city's own history against us. To him, you are just a thief. To the city, I am just a failed alchemist. We have to change the narrative. I'm tired of your philosophy. Vane, tell me how to kill it." "The Clockwork Tower," Vane pointed. "The main spring is made of ether steel. If you can strike the spring with the soul blade, You will broadcast the star's light through the city's own time stream. You won't just kill the king. You'll undo his existence before he ever left my laboratory. And what happens to you? Silas asked, looking at Vane's fading form. If you undo his existence, you undo the severance. Vane smiled, a sad, tired expression. Then I will be whole again, Silas, for a few seconds, at least, and then nature will take its course. I was dying before the shadow left, and I will be dying when it returns, but the city will live. Silas looked at the army of ash closing in. He looked at the massive, shifting god of shadows looming over them. He felt the silver in his veins pulse with a fierce, burning loyalty to a man who had lied to him and a city that had never given him a chance. Run for the tower, Vane, Silas said, his voice dropping into a resonant metallic bass. I'll clear the square. Silas didn't just fight. He danced. The soul blade was a blur of white gold fire, carving through the hollow like a scythe through wheat. Every strike released a burst of light that turned the ash back into dust. But for every 10 he felled, the king breathed out 100 more. The Shadow King turned his gaze toward the tower. He realized the plan. He let out a roar that shattered the windows of every building in the square. A massive tentacle of darkness lashed out, striking the Clockwork Tower and snapping the stone supports. The tower began to lean, the bronze gears grinding in protest. No! Vane screamed. Silas saw the tower tilting. He saw the king's shadow limbs wrapping around the ether steel spring. He realized he couldn't reach it in time, not by running. He looked at his silver arm. He felt the vacuum within it. He realized that the void rot wasn't just a curse. It was capacity. It was an empty space waiting to be filled. Vane! Get back! Silas didn't swing the blade. He held it to his chest and inhaled. He didn't breathe air. He breathed the light of the star. He pulled the soul blade's energy into his own void-infected body, using himself as a living capacitor. His silver skin began to crack, gold light leaking from the fissures. He was turning himself into a human sun, a paradox of light and shadow that the universe was not built to contain. With a scream that was part man and part star, Silas launched himself toward the top of the tilting tower. The great Clockwork Tower of Oakhaven did not merely tilt. It groaned like a titan being flayed alive. As Silas ascended the exterior masonry, his iridescent silver arm glowing with the internal fury of the star, he realized that the Shadow King was not simply trying to jam the gears. The king was attempting to turn the entire tower into a massive tuning fork, a metaphysical conductor that would broadcast a frequency of the void not just to the citizens' shadows, but to the very molecules of the city itself. The air around the belfry had become a swirling vortex of null atmosphere, where oxygen was replaced by a suffocating violet static. Silas lunged through the shattered remains of a rose window, his boots skidding on the bronze flooring of the gear chamber. The heat radiating from his chest was so intense that the ancient grease on the machinery began to smoke, filling the room with a pungent chemical haze. Vane! The gears are moving clockwise. Silas roared, the light from his silver skin reflecting off the thousands of interlocking teeth. I thought you said he was reversing time. Julian Vane's spectral form appeared behind a massive counterweight, his silhouette flickering like a dying candle. He changed his tactics, Silas. He isn't trying to unwrite the past anymore. He is trying to accelerate the future. He wants to pull Eldermurk into its eventual heat death, the moment when the last star flickers out and the void becomes absolute. He is skipping the journey and heading straight for silence. The Shadow King materialized in the center of the room, his form no longer a mere silhouette. He had woven the shadows of 100 stolen souls into a physical armor of obsidian scales. He stood 10 feet tall, a monstrous amalgamation of jagged edges and hollow spaces. Between his clawed hands, he held the ether steel mainspring, twisting it with a strength that made the iridescent metal scream in protest. "A thief and a ghost," the king's voice resonated, shaking the dust from the rafters, trying to save a city that is already a graveyard. Every tick of this clock is a heartbeat you can no longer afford. Silas, the star in your arm is a parasite. It isn't saving you. It is consuming you to power its own survival. Silas didn't hesitate. He swung the soul blade in a wide horizontal arc. A wave of white gold fire washed over the king's obsidian armor, the heat so great that the bronze gears nearest to them began to glow cherry red. But the king didn't flinch. He raised a hand, and a barrier of solidified shadow absorbed the impact, the golden fire turning into harmless black smoke. "The light is weak here," the king hissed. "In the heart of machine, logic is king, and my logic is the only one that remains." The king lunged, his movements a stuttering, non-linear blur. He struck Silas with a backhand that sent the young thief flying across the chamber. Silas slammed into the great bell of Oakhaven, the impact causing a toll that was heard for miles. The sound was not a clear ring. It was a distorted, mournful wail that sent a shockwave of nausea through Silas's nervous system. "Silas, get up." Vane's voice echoed in his mind. The ether steel is losing its resonance. If he snaps that spring, the timeline will fracture into 1,000 disconnected moments. The people in the square, they won't die. They will simply cease to have a now. Silas struggled to his feet, coughing up a spray of violet sparks. His silver arm was starting to feel heavy, the light beneath the skin pulsing with a frantic, irregular rhythm. He looked out through the shattered window. The great square was a nightmare. The golden halo he had hoped to trigger was being suffocated by the king's counterfrequency. The citizens were frozen in mid-scream, their bodies translucent, caught between existence and erasure. "I need more power," Silas whispered, his fingers tightening around the hilt of the soul blade. "You can't take more, Silas. The star will vaporize your consciousness." Vane warned, his ghostly face etched with terror. "If I don't, there won't be a consciousness left to vaporize." Silas didn't attack the king this time. He turned and plunged the soul blade into the center of the great bell. He began to channel the star's energy not into a strike, but into the sound. He was using the bell as a spiritual amplifier. The sound that erupted from the tower was world-shattering. It was a chord composed of absolute heat and absolute truth. The vibration tore the obsidian armor from the Shadow King's body, revealing the squirming, terrified souls trapped within. The violet static in the air was incinerated, replaced by a crystalline clarity. The king let out a shriek of genuine agony, his form beginning to dissipate under the sonic pressure. But as he fell back, he gave a final, desperate tug on the ether steel mainspring. Snap! The sound of the spring breaking was like the heartbeat of the world stopping. The tower didn't just stop moving. It froze in a state of impossible physics. The gears shattered, the bronze teeth flying through the air like shrapnel, only to hang motionless in midair. Outside, the sky turned a stark, blinding white. The purple sun and the black clouds vanished, replaced by a terrifying, empty void of pure potential. The Shadow King didn't vanish. He laughed, a sound of triumph that echoed through the frozen chamber. "The spring is broken, Julian. The now is gone. We are in the between, and here I am the only god." Silas looked around. Vane was frozen. The debris was frozen. Even the soul blade's fire was a static, unmoving sculpture of gold. Only Silas, protected by the silver rod in his veins, and the king, born of the void, could still move. "What did you do?" Silas asked, his voice sounding like it was coming from a great distance. "I have unmoored Eldermurk from the stream of time," the king said, his form expanding to fill the entire belfry. "We are no longer in the city. Biz, we are in the waiting room of the end, And here, I shall feast on the star until there is nothing left but the dark." The king's shadow limbs wrapped around Silas, pulling him toward the gaping maw in his chest. Silas felt his memories being stripped away. The smell of the rain, the weight of the silver, the sound of the city. He was becoming a blank page. But in the silence of between, Silas heard something else. A faint, rhythmic clicking. It wasn't coming from the tower. It was coming from his own silver arm. The void rot hadn't just changed his skin. It had synchronized with the star. He was a living clock. Vane said identity is a weight, Silas whispered, his eyes turning into twin golden singularities. But a weight is what keeps the clock ticking. Silas didn't try to break free. He pulled the Shadow King closer, embracing the darkness. He forced the star's light to synchronize with the king's void frequency. He was creating a new mainspring, not made of steel, but his own silvered soul. A new light began to grow in the center of the frozen tower, a light that was neither gold nor black, but shimmering iridescent pearl. The between began to crack. Silas felt as though his consciousness was being stretched across a vast, infinite loom. His physical body was still in the tower, but his mind was everywhere. He could feel the heartbeat of every citizen frozen in the great square below, and he could sense the ancient, dormant machinery buried deep within the iron valleys. By synchronizing the star with his own void-tainted blood, he had become the bridge. He was the only thing keeping Eldermurk from drifting off the map of existence and into the eternal silence of the Unmaker. "Vane!" Silas called out, his voice echoing through the pearlescent fog. Beside him, Julian Vane began to move, but his motions were jerky and slowed, like a marionette being pulled by tangled strings. The Alchemist looked around the frozen belfry, his eyes wide with a mixture of professional curiosity and existential terror. "Silas, what have you done? You've triggered a lateral shift. We aren't in the city anymore, but we aren't in the void either. We are in the drafts, the space where the universe keeps its unfinished thoughts." "A draft that I shall burn!" the Shadow King roared. The entity lunged again, but the pearl light acted as a viscous fluid, slowing the king's movements until he was moving as if underwater. The king's form began to splinter into dozens of smaller shadows, each one a different regret or a different sin taken from Julian Vane's long life. They scurried across the frozen bronze wheels, looking for a way to break Silas's concentration. "I can't hold this forever." Silas gritted his teeth, the silver iridescence on his skin beginning to crack under strain. The ether steel spring is broken, Vane. The now is a shattered glass. How do we put it back together? Vane scrambled toward the central spindle of the clock, his spectral hands passing through the motionless machinery. The spring was just a conductor. The true anchor of Eldermurk's time isn't here in the tower. It's in the founding shards. When the city was built, four alchemical anchors were placed in the four corners of the district to keep the fog from swallowing the streets. The Shadow King hasn't just broken the clock. He's disconnected the anchors. We have to find them in this between state and realign them to your new frequency. "Where are they?" Silas asked, his vision starting to tunnel as the power of the star began to leak from his pores. "One in the Sunken Archive, one in the Iron Valleys, one in the Grey Marshes, and the last is in the heart of Oakhaven's cathedral." Vane explained, pointing toward the window. Outside, the city of Eldermurk looked like a ghost of itself. The buildings were translucent, and the streets were filled with a thick, white mist that seemed to be made of unwritten words. The citizens were still there, frozen like statues of porcelain, their faces fixed in expressions of eternal surprise. But the shadows that had been attacking them were gone, pulled back into the king's central mass. "Go, Silas," Vane commanded. "I will stay here and try to keep the spindle from collapsing entirely. My spectral nature is suited for this stillness, but you are the only one who can move through the labyrinth." Silas didn't hesitate. He stepped out of the belfry window, but he didn't fall. In the between, gravity was a matter of willpower. He began to run across the air, his boots striking the pearlescent mist as if it were solid stone. Every step he took sent a ripple of color through the white world, a brief flash of the real Eldermurk trying to reassert itself. He headed toward the Oakhaven Cathedral, the closest of the anchor sites. As he moved through the frozen streets, he saw the true cost of the king's rebellion. He passed a young woman frozen in the act of reaching for a child. The child was already beginning to fade, the edges of its form blurring into the white fog. If Silas didn't find the shard soon, these people wouldn't just die. They would never have existed at all. Suddenly, the white mist ahead of him began to turn black. The Shadow King had sent a portion of himself to intercept. A void wraith, a creature made of serrated shadows and glowing violet eyes, manifested in the center of the street. It didn't speak. It simply let out a sound like a violin string snapping. Silas raised the soul blade, but the white gold fire was dim in this place. The pearl light of his own skin was his only true weapon now. He lunged at the wraith, and as they collided, the sensation was like hitting a wall of ice. The wraith tried to drain the heat from his body, but Silas channeled the star's resonance through his silver arm, turning the cold into a shattering vibration. The wraith exploded into a cloud of soot, but Silas felt a piece of his own memory vanish. He forgot the name of the street he was on. He forgot the color of the coat he used to wear. The Between was a place of trade. To change it, you had to give it something of yourself. He reached the Cathedral of Oakhaven. The massive Gothic structure was covered in a frost that glowed with a faint, sickly green light. Inside, the pews were filled with frozen worshippers, their hands clasped in a prayer that would never be finished. At the altar, protected by a circle of ancient salt, sat the first founding shard, a cube of pure, unrefined ether steel. It was vibrating with a discordant hum, out of sync with the world. Silas reached for the shard, but as his hand grew close, the salt line erupted. A guardian, born from the collective fears of the congregation, rose from the floor. It was a penitent, a towering figure draped in heavy, rusted chains, its face hidden behind a mass of hammered lead. Who seeks to restart the agony of time? The penitent's voice boomed, sounding like 1,000 funeral bells. In the stillness, there is no pain. In the white, there is no hunger. Why do you wish to return to the world of shadows? Because the world of shadows is where we live. Silas shouted, his silver arm flaring with a sudden, defiant brilliance. It's where we bleed and it's where we hope. You can't keep them in this porcelain life forever. The penitent swung a massive chain. The links glowed with a cold, blue fire. Silas dodged a blow, the chain smashing through a marble pillar, as if it were paper. He realized he couldn't fight this guardian with strength alone. The penitent was fueled by the worshipper's desire for peace, a peace that was actually a form of death. Silas closed his eyes. He didn't focus on the light of the star. He focused on the pain of the gutters. He focused on the hunger he had felt as a child, the cold of the marshes, and the weight of the silver he had stolen to survive. He fed these memories of living pain into the pearl light of his arm. He grabbed the chain as it swung toward him again. Instead of being burned by the blue fire, he allowed the fire to see his truth. The penitent froze. The rusted chains began to turn into flowers, then into dust. As the guardian realized that its mercy was a cage, the penitent dissolved into a sigh of relief, and the lead mask hit the floor with a hollow clang. Silas reached the altar and grabbed the founding shard. As his fingers touched the ether steel, a jolt of electricity shot through his body. The shard began to glow with a pearl light, synchronizing with the resonance of his heart. Immediately, the cathedral began to change. The white frost melted away, and the worshippers gained a sliver of color. They didn't wake up yet, but they were no longer fading. The anchor was set, but the Shadow King's laughter echoed through the vaulted ceiling. One anchor, little thief? There are 4 corners of the world, and I have already sent my harvesters to the other 3. By the time you reach the Grey Marshes, the water will have turned to ink, and the memory of the light will be a myth. Silas looked at the glowing shard in his hand. He had the first key, but his body felt lighter, more translucent. He was losing himself to the between. "Vane, can you hear me?" Silas whispered into the air. "I hear you, Silas." Vane's voice replied, sounding distant and fragile. "The tower is holding, but the void rot is spreading to the foundations. You must reach the Sunken Archive next. It is a repository of the city's logic. If the king erases the archive, the city will forget how to stand." Silas stepped out of the cathedral and looked toward the district of the archive. The white mist was thickening, and the path ahead was filled with the flickering shapes of 1,000 more wraiths. He gripped the soul blade in the founding shard, his silver arm now glowing with a steady, pearlescent fire. He wasn't just a thief anymore. He was the weaver, and he had a city to stitch back together. Silas sprinted across the frozen rooftops of Oakhaven, his boots leaving glowing, pearlescent footprints on the static-heavy slate. The air was no longer just cold. It was thin, a vacuum of information where the sound of his own breathing seemed to travel miles before reaching his ears. To his left, the great Clockwork tower stood like a jagged needle, Vane's spectral light still flickering at the summit. A lone candle in a world of white fog. "The Sunken Archive," Silas whispered, his voice sounding like a ghost's. Ahead of him, the district of the archive was a nightmare of architectural instability. In this between-state, the great library didn't just sit on the ground. It floated in a dozen different pieces, each one a different wing of the massive complex. Hundreds of thousands of books and scrolls were suspended in midair, their pages fluttering in a wind that didn't exist. Each page was blank, the ink having been drained by the Shadow King's influence to fuel his own expansion. As Silas approached the floating ruins, he saw the erasers. They weren't like the Void Race or the Penitent. They were small, eyeless creatures with limbs like calligraphy pens, scurrying over the floating books. Where they touched a page, the very fiber of the paper dissolved into white mist. They weren't just destroying the books. They were unwriting the logic of Eldermurk. The archive is the mind of the city. The Shadow King's voice drifted through the static, sounding smug and omnipresent. If a city forgets its laws, its architecture, and its names, what remains? Only a hollow shell for me to inhabit. You are fighting for a book that has already been bleached white, Silas. I don't need to read the book to know it belongs to us. Silas roared. He leapt from a rooftop, his silver arm reaching out to grab a floating banister. He swung himself onto a platform that had once been the wing of civil engineering. Beneath his feet, the floor was composed of blueprints and schematics, all flickering between reality and nothingness. If the archive fell, the buildings of Eldermurk would literally forget how to stand. At the center of the floating debris was the second founding shard, the anchor of reason. It was a sphere of polished obsidian, trapped within a cage of brass gears that were spinning in a frantic, non-linear pattern. Standing between Silas and the shard was a figure that made his heart freeze. It was a duplicate of himself, or rather, a version of himself that had never found the soul blade. This shadow Silas wore the same tattered thief's cloak, but his eyes were pits of pure violet ink. He held a dagger made of solidified erasure. "You are a thief of light," the shadow Silas said, his voice a perfect, chilling mimicry. "But I am the thief of you. Every time you use that star, you give me more of your skin. Look at your arm. Silas, how much of the boy from the gutters is left? Enough to put you down." Silas lunged. The fight was unlike any Silas had ever experienced. It was a battle of reflections. When Silas swung the soul blade, the shadow Silas mimicked the move with perfect precision, his blade of erasure negating the white gold fire. They moved through the floating library, crashing through shelves of blank books, their duel creating ripples of color that tore through the white fog of the between. Silas realized that he couldn't win by force. The shadow Silas was powered by his own self-doubt, the part of him that believed he was nothing more than a criminal who had stumbled into a hero's role. Every time he doubted his right to hold the star, the shadow Silas grew stronger, his violet eyes glowing with a predatory triumph. "You don't belong in the light," the double hissed, pinning Silas against a floating globe. "You are a creature of the dark, just like me. Drop the blade and let the silence take us. It's easier than being a lie." Silas felt the gray rot in his veins pulse. He looked at his translucent fingers. He was a thief. He was a liar. But he was also the only person who had stayed to fight when the sky turned purple. "I am a lie," Silas whispered, a grim smile spreading across his face. "But I'm a lie that chose to be true." Instead of pushing the shadow Silas away, Silas pulled him in. He dropped the soul blade and wrapped his silver arm around his double in a crushing embrace. He channeled the pearlescent light of the first shard directly into the double's chest. The shadow Silas shrieked, his form beginning to blur. He wasn't being destroyed. He was being integrated. The light forced the shadow to acknowledge the person it was supposed to be. In a burst of violet and gold sparks, the double dissolved, flowing into Silas's own skin. Silas gasped as a flood of memories returned. The smell of the stew his mother used to make, the sound of the rain on a tin roof, the first time he had ever successfully picked a pocket. The Between had tried to take them, but by conquering his shadow, he had reclaimed them. His hand was no longer translucent. It was solid once more. He turned to the anchor of reason. The brass gears were slowing down, the obsidian sphere beginning to pulse with a steady, logical beat. Silas reached through the cage, the gears parting for his silver hand like water, and gripped the sphere. The moment he touched it, the floating fragments of the archive began to stabilize. The blank pages of the books didn't fill with ink yet, but they stopped dissolving. The erasers shrieked and vanished into the fog, their purpose negated by the return of logic to the district. The second anchor was set. A massive tremor shook the Between. Silas looked toward the horizon, where the Grey Marshes lay. The white fog there was being replaced by a thick, oily black sludge. The Shadow King was concentrating his remaining power on the third anchor, realizing that Silas was winning the war for the city soul. "Vane! 2 down." Silas shouted into the air. "Good! Good, Silas." Vane's voice came through, but it was accompanied by a wet, hacking cough. "But the king he is accelerating the rot in the tower. The bronze is turning to glass. I don't know how much longer I can hold the spindle." "Hold it, Julian. I'm going to the marshes." Silas leapt from the stabilized ruins of the archive, his body feeling heavier and more grounded than before. He had 2 of the 4 anchors, but the Grey Marshes were the most treacherous part of Eldermurk even in the best of times. In between, they were a graveyard of dead timelines. As he ran toward the marshes, the ground beneath his feet turned from stone to a viscous, gray liquid that tried to pull him under with every step. The third founding shard, the anchor of fluidity, was hidden deep beneath the mercury waters of the marsh, guarded by the things that Eldermurk had tried to forget, and standing at the edge of the sludge, waiting for him, was the Shadow King's greatest general. A towering, multi-limbed horror made of the shadows of the Alchemist Vane had surpassed and discarded. 2 anchors, the horror whispered, its dozen mouths speaking in a terrifying unison. But can a thief swim in a sea of his own sins? Silas leveled the soul blade of the beast. The iridescent silver of his arm, now etched with the geometric patterns of the archive's logic. "I've been swimming in them my whole life. I'm used to the taste." He dived into the gray sludge, the light of the star cutting through the dark like a submarine sun. The Grey Marshes in between were no longer composed of water or silt. They were a vast, stagnant ocean of liquid regret. Every drop of the gray sludge contained a memory that Eldermurk had collectively tried to drown, broken promises, failed inventions, and the silent tears of 1,000 forgotten souls. Silas dived into this abyss, the soul blade in his right hand cutting a path of white gold fire through the mercury-like depths, while his silver left arm pulsed with the pearlescent light of the first 2 anchors. He was no longer breathing air. He was breathing the very essence of the city's history. As he descended deeper, the pressure became immense. The shadows of discarded Alchemists, the king's general, swirled around him like predatory sharks. Their many mouths chanted a litany of Julian Vane's failures, trying to fill Silas's mind with the same rot that had destroyed the Alchemist. "You are a vessel for a dead man's guilt," the voices hissed, vibrating through the liquid. "The heart of the star will burn you away, and the void will inherit the ashes. Why do you fight for a balance that cannot be maintained?" Silas ignored them. He saw the 3rd founding shard at the bottom of the trench, the anchor of fluidity. It was a giant, translucent emerald that shifted shape every second, mimicking the flow of the tides. But it was being strangled by void barnacles, parasitic growths that were drinking the emerald's light and replacing it with stagnant, black ink. Silas reached the emerald, but the General of Shadows slammed into him, a dozen limbs wrapping around his silver arm. The cold was absolute. Silas felt his heartbeat slowing, the pearlescent light flickering. He realized that the General wasn't just fighting him. It was trying to drown him in the certainty of failure. "Vane gave up, but I didn't," Silas roared, his voice creating a bubble of pure gold in the gray deep. He didn't use the soul blade to strike. He reached out with his silver arm and grabbed the void barnacles directly. He channeled the logic of the 2nd shard and the hope of the first through his own body. He wasn't just a conduit anymore. He was a filter. He took the black ink into himself, letting it pass through his silver skin and out into the star's fire, where it was purified. The emerald shard flared to life, its green light merging with Silas's iridescence. The General of Shadows let out a final, bubbling shriek before dissolving into harmless silt. The 3rd anchor was set. Silas erupted from the surface of the marshes, propelled by a geyser of green and gold light. He landed on the shifting shore, gasping for air that felt like liquid fire. He had 3 anchors. Only one remained. The anchor of the soul, hidden in the deepest foundations of the Iron Valleys. But as he looked toward the center of the between, the great Clockwork Tower was undergoing a horrific transformation. It was no longer made of stone or bronze. It had become a pillar of pure, shrieking shadow. The Shadow King had realized that he couldn't stop Silas from gathering the shards, so he was doing the unthinkable. He was consuming Julian Vane's physical form to create a static singularity. "Silas!" Vane's voice came through, but it was no longer a whisper. It was a scream of agony. "He is merging us. He is using my life force to bridge the gap between the between and the real world. If he succeeds, Eldermurk will be erased and replaced by a permanent void. I'm coming, Julian." Silas shouted, but he knew he couldn't reach the tower without the final shard. He turned toward the Iron Valleys. The path was a jagged climb through mountains of rusted gears and obsidian shards. The 4th shard, the anchor of the soul, was guarded by the king's final defense, the Kronos Behemoth, a creature made of the very time matter the king had stolen from the city. Silas sprinted, his silver body now a blur of emerald, gold, and pearl light. He was no longer just a thief. He was a force of nature. He reached the heart of the valleys, where the behemoth waited, a colossal, shifting mass of clockwork and shadow that stood 100 feet tall. "The final piece," Silas whispered, looking at the glowing white core within the behemoth's chest. The soul of the city. He didn't wait for the monster to move. He launched himself into the air, the soul blade trailing a wake of fire that lit up the entire between. The final battle for the foundations of reality had begun. The Chronos behemoth roared, a sound that tore through the fabric of between, creating rifts that showed glimpses of a world that never was, a version of Eldermurk where the sun never rose, and another where the city was made of gold. Silas ignored the distractions. He was a pinpoint of absolute intent. He slammed into Behemoth's chest, the soul blade carving through the clockwork armor. The monster struck back with a fist of solidified time, hitting Silas with the weight of a century. Silas felt his bones shatter, but the star's light instantly knitted them back together. He was beyond human fragility now. He was a living event. Give it back! Silas roared, plunging his silver hand into Behemoth's core. He grabbed the fourth founding shard, the anchor of the soul. The moment his fingers closed around the white crystal, the Behemoth dissolved into a whirlwind of rusted gears. Silas stood in the center of the storm, holding all four shards. The resonance was deafening. Emerald, obsidian, ether steel, and white crystal. All four anchors were now synchronized with Silas's heart. He felt the entire city of Eldermurk as if it were his own body. He felt every breath, every heartbeat, every shadow. He turned toward the great Clockwork Tower. The static singularity was reaching its peak. The Shadow King was a colossal vortex of darkness, with Julian Vane's pale, suffering form suspended at its center, like a trapped fly. Silas, do it now. Vane's voice echoed through the world. The final paradox. Merge the anchors. Rewrite the code. Silas didn't run to the tower. He didn't need to. He stood in the center of the Iron Valleys and raised both arms. He brought the four shards together, crushing them against the soul blade in his chest. I am the thief. Silas shouted, his voice reaching every corner of the between. And I am stealing the city back from the dark. The explosion was not of light, but of meaning. A wave of absolute reality swept out from Silas. A system restore that moved faster than thought. Wherever the wave touched, the between dissolved. The white fog evaporated, replaced by the honest, soot-stained stone of the real Eldermurk. The porcelain statues of the people became flesh and blood again, their screams turning into gasps of life. The Shadow King shrieked as the light hit him. He wasn't being destroyed, he was being contextualized. The void energy was being forced back into the shadows of the objects it belonged to. He shrank, his massive form collapsing inward, until he was nothing more than a small, flickering silhouette on the floor of the belfry. Julian Vane fell from the center of the vortex, landing softly on the bronze gears. He was whole again. His shadow was back at his feet, silent and anchored. The soul blade shattered. The star's energy, having fulfilled its purpose, dispersed into the atmosphere of Eldermurk, giving the city a faint, golden glow that would last for generations. Silas woke up on the roof of the great Clockwork Tower. The sun was rising, a true, warm sun. His silver arm was gone, replaced by his human skin, though a faint, pearlescent scar remained on his palm. He felt heavy. He felt tired. He felt like Silas. Beside him sat Julian Vane. The alchemist looked ancient, but his eyes were clear. You did it, Silas. You anchored the soul of the city. We did it, Vane, Silas whispered, looking at the people emerging into the great square below. But don't expect me to pick any more pockets for a while. I'm retired. Vane chuckled, a dry, raspy sound. The archive will need a new curator. Someone who knows the value of a story that hasn't been erased. What do you say? Silas looked at the horizon, where the mist was finally retreating. I think I like that. Eldermurk was still a city of smoke and secrets. But for the first time in its history, the shadows were just shadows, and the light was something everyone could share. The severance is healed, and the Alchemist's shadow has found its place in the light. Eldermurk stands tall once more, but its stones remember the weight of the void. If you survive this journey through the between and witness the birth of the Soul Blade, make sure to subscribe to our chronicles. Like this video to keep the Great Clockwork Tower turning, and comment below. If your shadow spoke to you today, would you listen to its secrets or silence its voice forever? Stay in the light, stay vigilant, and remember, even in the darkest soot, a star can still be found. Until the next chronicle begins.